someone wants to, if you just want to raise your hand or whatever, that's perfectly fine with me. Okay, let's see. Is this visible? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So, okay, so my goal in this talk really is to, first of all, share with you a bit of my research that uses some of these methods. But I'm also hoping in this talk to give you sort of an overview of some common artificial language learning methodologies and designs. So it's sort of this double goal of sharing some research with you of mine, but also having sort of an instructive overview of some methods that get used. I've decided to go sort of broad here to cover several different kinds of studies as opposed to deep. But feel free to ask me, any questions if you want to know more details about any of the studies that I talk about. Okay. All right, so these slides I will put on my webpage, which you can Google me if you want to find them to refer back to at some point after today. They're not there yet, but they will be later. Okay, so first I'm going to start out with a bit of, to talk about a couple things that Alex and Maura sort of touched on, but maybe in some cases it's just a different, slightly different, not perspective, but different wording, I guess. So one thing I like to think about is in terms of the big picture of what we do as, say, linguists or cognitive scientists working on language. Really, we have some input. So that could be in an experiment, you give participants input, or it could be input to children, whatever the case may be. And then a bunch of things happen, and then you get some kind of output. So that could be responses that people give in an experiment, or it could be productions that speakers give or whatever. And at least the input and the output are, in theory, observable, so you can sort of measure them and understand what they are. But everything that happens in this sort of big black box in the middle is unobservable, at least not directly. So I think a lot of what it is that we do as linguists is try to sort of reverse engineer what happens in this black box that lets you go from this input to the output. So in this context, I think artificial language learning experiments is just one tool that we have that lets us sort of, make hypotheses and theories about what it is that goes on between input and output. So one thing that I think is useful to think about as well when you're talking about artificial language experiments is sort of different kinds of biases. Depending on your background, this may or may not be this may or may not be unusual for you to think about things in this way, but we can sort of define both hard biases and soft biases. So a hard bias would be something that's like an absolute restriction. So if you have a grammar or a language that's not consistent with that bias, then it's not at all available to the learner. So we could say that's not a possible language at all. So this would be sort of your traditional view of UG or universal grammar. And it has the effect of sort of majorly restricting your hypothesis space. So it makes the learning problem really simple. So if you're familiar with frameworks like principles and parameters or classical OT, these are frameworks that sort of have this hard bias mentality of universal grammar, where the hypothesis space of what is a possible language is dramatically restricted. But you can also have a sort of soft bias. And soft biases are more like learning preferences. So we can say that grammars or languages that are inconsistent with a soft bias are dispreferred by learners, though possibly still available. So instead of saying that it's not a possible language, we could say that that's not a likely language. And this kind of perspective allows you greater leeway in what is a possible language while still constraining your hypothesis space somewhat. And when we think about soft biases in this way, these are more easily implemented in a more probabilistic model. So you think about models like maximum entropy models or Bayesian models or probabilistic harmonic grammar, things like this, when we look at biases in this way. And I think when we are doing artificial language experiments, usually we're thinking of biases more in this way. So we're not expecting that the things that we're looking at are going to be languages that are completely unavailable to learners. So instead, we're looking at sort of preferences that people have. So we're looking more for like soft biases. And just sort of a quick sort of visual of this, the sort of traditional view will have this very sharp separation between what's a possible language and what's an impossible language. And the sort of soft bias view would have this more glossy kind of view of what's a probable language. And then on the outskirts, you maybe have what's an improbable language. So I sort of look at things, and I think probably most of us who do this kind of research look at things more on the soft bias view here, where you have probable and improbable languages. Okay, I think Alex already laid out some advantages of doing sort of why you would do artificial language experiments, so I think I'll just skip through this quite quickly. So given that we're going to use an artificial language experiment, how is it that we show that there is a learning bias? Like, what is the kind of strategy for doing this? And the way I like to think about it is that you have this sort of null hypothesis. I put null in kind of quotes here because I don't mean that it's sort of like in the statistical sense. But what I mean here is that we sort of assume that if there's no bias going on, that learners learn exactly what you provide them in the input, so nothing more, nothing less. Whatever you give them, that's what they learn. So in the event that that doesn't happen, so you give some kind of input in an experiment and people don't learn what's in that input, then we can say that there's a learning bias. So based on this, there's sort of two kind of basic strategies, I think, well, at least two basic strategies for demonstrating that you have some kind of bias. And these were also touched on by Alex and Maura. So one is like if you have underlearning, so you say pattern A and pattern B are equally supported in the input you give people. Pattern A is learned, but pattern B is not learned, or it's not learned as quickly or as completely as pattern A, then that suggests there's some kind of bias that favors pattern A over pattern B. And the other kind of strategy is that people make sort of assumptions without having any evidence. So your input lacks information about certain cases or it's ambiguous. In that case, if you see that learners make sort of principled assumptions about these unseen cases, you can't attribute whatever their behavior is to the input or to chance. Then you might say there's some kind of bias that's causing them to generalize or make that in that way or make that sort of assumption. Okay. So that's sort of a bit of an introduction. So the first thing I want to talk about here really is two sort of biases that have been studied very extensively, at least in the phonology literature. And this is comparing phonetic naturalness and simplicity. So this is something that Alex actually touched on. I'm going to also start with talking about vowel harmony, probably the most studied type of thing in phonology, artificial language learning. And I'm actually going to start with this study by Pika et al. I think this is a really good study to start with, even though it's not my own research, for a couple of reasons. For one, it sort of has this very straightforward design with very clear hypotheses, and it's very easy to understand. So I think it's a good place for us to start off. And secondly, this study, I think, was sort of the beginning of the renaissance, if you will, for artificial language learning experiments, at least in phonology, I think maybe more generally. So this was back in 2003 in a Wakeful proceedings. There were some artificial language experiments before this, but at least in phonology, this sort of, I think, kicked off the big increase in artificial language experiments that we've seen since then. Okay, so as Alex sort of said, in a vowel harmony system, what you get is some feature of a vowel then sort of spreads onto a nearby vowel. And in a disharmony system, you get sort of the opposite. So some feature of a vowel, the vowels next to it need to be mismatching. So it needs to have the opposite feature value. And we see a sort of discrepancy here. So vowel harmony is typologically very common. and it's also phonetically motivated. So from a sort of articulatory point of view, harmony is a sort of assimilation pattern. So that means that it makes the vowels that are next to each other more like each other. So that would make it easier to articulate. So it has this sort of underlying phonetic motivation. Disharmony, on the other hand, is very rare typologically, and at least vowel disharmony especially is very rare. And it's not phonetically motivated, so there's no clear articulatory explanation for why you would have vowel disharmony. Okay, so in this Pica et al. Study, they sort of pitted against each other two sorts of hypotheses about what kinds of biases might be involved. The first would be a naturalness hypothesis or phonetic naturalness hypothesis. And here they say, given what we just said about the underlying phonetic motivation for vowel harmony, a vowel harmony pattern would be easy to learn, and a vowel disharmony pattern should be difficult to learn if there's some kind of phonetic naturalness bias going on. At the same time, they talked about a simplicity bias, a simplicity hypothesis. And in this case, a vowel harmony pattern or a vowel disharmony pattern should be relatively easy to learn because they involve just one feature. So if you know one feature of a vowel, then you know what the next vowel needs to be. There's only one feature that you need to keep track of. And under this hypothesis, what would be a bit more difficult to learn is if multiple features of a vowel determined what the next vowel would be. So a more complex kind of pattern. Okay, so we'll see an example of this in a minute. So what they did was they taught people one of three languages. So they had three different groups of people. The first was a vowel harmony language, and in this language, front stems, if the stem had a front vowel, then the suffix would have a front vowel. If the stem had a back vowel, then the suffix would have a back vowel. The second was a vowel disharmony language. In this case, if the stem had a front vowel, then the suffix would have a back vowel, so the opposite value. And if there was a back stem, then it would have a front suffix. And the third category, the third language, was an arbitrary sort of pattern. In this case, you had a sort of arbitrary combination of vowels. So I, A, O, that's two front vowels and a back vowel. And if you have one of those vowels, then you would have a front suffix. And if you had one of the other vowels, then you would have a back suffix. So some arbitrary combination of vowels would determine which suffix you got. So there's a pretty clear sort of set of predictions about what you should get if you have these different biases in play. If you just have phonetic naturalness, then you would expect that the vowel harmony pattern, which is natural, which is phonetically motivated, would be learned the best, and the other two would be worse. If you just have simplicity, then you would expect that the vowel harmony or disharmony pattern would be better than the arbitrary pattern. The vowel harmony and disharmony pattern only require you to track one feature. The arbitrary pattern requires you to track multiple features. So the arbitrary would be the worst. And if you have both of the biases together, then you would have this sort of stepladder arrangement where vowel harmony is the best, being both phonetically motivated and simple, and arbitrary would be the worst, being unmotivated and not simple. All right. So they ran an experiment. They had 30 English speakers with 10 per group. So you might note this is very low. This is a very low number of participants. So just keep that in mind, 10 per group. In terms of stimuli, their stems were CVC, and the front vowels were I, E, A. The back vowels were U, U, A. And then they had some variety of consonants. And then they had a suffix that alternated between ek, which is a front vowel, and uk, which is a back vowel. In terms of the procedure, they told participants they would be hearing singular plural pairs in a novel language. And so there were three phases. The first is a listening phase. So they would just, the people would hear trials like geep, geepek. So that would be a harmony case, or geep, geepuk would be a disharmony case. Then they had the learning phase. So here they would see GPEC and then be asked if this was correct or not, and then they would get feedback. So you might note this is an extremely explicit learning condition. Uh, Anytime you give someone a test like this and then give the feedback, it's pretty explicit. Then they would have a test phase. In this case, they would get some new trials, so FIGEC, and they would be asked if that was correct or not. And then in the test phase, they didn't get feedback anymore. Okay, so that was the design and the method. So here's what they found in this study. So on the x-axis, we have the 3 different languages that people learn: vowel harmony, disharmony, and arbitrary. And on the y-axis, we have the % correct responses for each participant. Okay, so you can see here that even though there's a numerical difference between vowel harmony and disharmony, there was no statistical difference. That difference was non-significant. So no difference between vowel harmony and disharmony, but there was a difference between both the disharmony and the arbitrary case and the harmony and arbitrary case. All right. Another thing that's helpful when you're looking at results, anytime you have this kind of test, so this test we would call a 2 alternative forced choice test. So people are choosing between 2 options, in this case, so correct or not correct. And anytime you have a test like that, we can look at the chance level performance and compare that. So chance in this case would be 50%. So we can compare these different conditions to 50%. And we see in the arbitrary case, it's around 50%. So there we can say that people didn't really learn anything. They're basically responding at chance level. So when it was an arbitrary pattern, they didn't really learn anything. By contrast, we can sort of, I don't know the statistical comparison, but looking at the numbers, it looks like in the disharmony and vowel harmony case that something was learned. So they learned some kind of pattern. Those numbers are above chance level. Okay, so the conclusion from this study was basically, yeah, so there's no difference between vowel harmony and disharmony, but there's a big difference between both of those in the arbitrary case. So these results look like they support the view that there's no sort of naturalness bias here. The only bias going on is this sort of simplicity bias. People find it harder to learn this more complicated arbitrary pattern, but both of the simple patterns, people are fine at learning. Okay. I would say, so you can think about, if you look at the vowel harmony versus disharmony case, there's very few participants in the study. There's a numerical difference there. You sort of might guess that if they tripled the number of participants, that difference might be significant. So I think people were sort of aware of this. But since then, in the years after that, there were a couple of more studies looking at vowel harmony that showed the similar kind of pattern. And I think the sort of idea at this point in the field was, okay, there's no difference between vowel harmony and disharmony. Those things are, equally learnable. So there's no kind of naturalness bias that favors vowel harmony. Any difference between vowel harmony and disharmony, that doesn't have to do with learning. That's something else. Yeah. Okay. So on the basis of this and some sort of subsequent experiments that I won't talk about, this sort of picture sort of emerged, I would say, about how these biases work, at least in phonology. So we can sort of break down what we might call, so Elliott Morton's term for this is analytic biases. So that basically just means learning biases. And there's sort of 2 big categories here. We can have domain general mechanisms. So that would be the sort of simplicity bias, and a lot of other things would fall under that category as well. And we would have sort of domain specific biases. So, roughly similar to what people might think of as universal grammar, things that are specific to language. And under that, we would have something like what we might call substantive biases that Alex and Maura talked about earlier. And these substantive biases are basically what people usually mean when they talk about naturalness, in phonology at least, phonetic naturalness, phonological naturalness. This usually means this sort of domain-specific substantive bias. So there was this sort of breakdown, and the sort of picture that emerged for a while is these domain general mechanisms like simplicity are very robust. You see them, support for them in study after study, and they're not controversial. So basically, you ask anybody, and everyone agrees, yeah, these kinds of mechanisms play a role in learning. As far as I know, nobody disagrees with that. And then you have these sort of substantive biases, and these are much weaker. So in experiments, you see no effect or you see a very weak effect, and they're controversial. So a lot of people say that these don't actually play a role in learning. So this picture sort of emerged, and there's a really good review paper or pair of review papers by Morton and Pater back in 2012 that discusses these issues in quite a lot of depth. And I would recommend them if you're interested in getting into this field of artificial language learning. I'd recommend that you have a look at these review papers because they're really good at talking about this sort of breakdown. So this picture sort of emerged over the next decade, and I'd say in this context, studies that show clear evidence for sort of substantive biases are really valuable because the sort of viewpoint for a while was that, they're weak or maybe non-existent. Okay, this is just a word of warning, which is that at least in phonology especially, this terminology is extremely murky. People will use naturalness when they really mean some kind of domain general thing like simplicity. They'll use simplicity to refer to something that they really mean as a sort of domain-specific bias. The terminology is extremely murky, so be cautious. Another issue is that this is a point discussed by Morton and Pater quite a lot. These two are often conflated with each other. So it's very often the case that people may say that they're looking at sort of naturalness or substantive bias, but really there's also a simplicity explanation. And so that makes it very difficult often to tease apart what's really causing these effects. Okay, so that's just a bit of sort of context setting for you, giving you sort of the background and the history here. Okay, so we're going to go back to harmony. One thing I should say, since Alex mentioned his study, his 2020 study in his talk, is that Alex sort of redid a study similar to the Pika et al. Study and found an actual difference. So found an effect where vowel harmony was learned better than disharmony in that study. So you can also check out that study. That's a more recent study. I'm going to talk about a study that Alex and I did, also Alex Martin and I did recently. I think the study was sort of conceived, if I remember properly, I think it was in Dusseldorf, walking along the river, where we were just talking about vowel harmony and talking about this sort of state of the field that I was just talking to you about. And we were thinking that basically all of these studies that have had this sort of opinion assume that people learn a certain kind of generalization about harmony or disharmony. So in terms of harmony, they assume that people learn this kind of rule here. So a vowel takes on the feature of a preceding vowel, or you could formalize that as constraints. So don't have mismatching vowels next to each other, however you want to do it. Either way, it predicts that people have learned to favor this sort of structure. So all front vowels or all back vowels. And in disharmony, the assumption is that people have learned this kind of generalization. So a vowel takes on the opposite feature of a preceding vowel, or don't have matching vowels next to each other if you formalize it as a constraint. And again, either way, that predicts that what people have learned is that it's okay to have these alternating patterns. So front, back, or back, front, back, front. But we felt a bit skeptical about this. So our question sort of was, if participants learn something like yeep, yeepuk, this very kind of simple two-syllable word or something like that, have they really learned a general disharmony rule? There's a lot of things that they could have learned, But would they actually extend this pattern to this hypothetical longer word? Like, would they, seeing geep geepuk, would they learn to favor hypothetical geep uk ep ut with this sort of alternating front back pattern? Our sort of hunch was that no, they haven't learned that this is what you should have, this alternating pattern. And if not, can we really say that disharmony is equally learnable? So we sort of devised this study to kind of test this. And in this case, people learned one of two languages. So they learned either a harmony language. So in this case, they saw harmonic stems and learned that it should take a harmonic suffix. So petit, you get petit fi, petit, or you get petit be. So in this study, they learned two different suffixes, like a fi-fu suffix and a be-bo suffix. So at the front stem, you get a front suffix. If you have a back stem like pogu, you get a back suffix like pogu-fu or pogu-bo. Or they learned a disharmony language. So in this case, if you have petu, you would get petu-fi or petu-be, so you get the front suffix. If you have a stem ending in a front vowel, then you would get the back version. So pogi, you get pogi-fu or pogi-bo. I've sort of colored in with different colors the front and the back vowels because I think it makes it a lot easier to sort of see whether they match or whether you get the alternating pattern or what. Okay. So the test here in this experiment is going to be what happens if we force participants to add both of the suffixes at one time without telling them that that's what they're going to be doing. Okay, so our method here this was an online study, so we eventually ended up with 120 English speakers who passed our attention checks. One sort of note is that if you're doing an online study, people are often awful. And I think we recruited maybe 300 people, and out of that, only 120 passed the attention checks. So a sort of lesson here is that if you're doing an online study, you want to have really robust attention checks just to make sure people are actually paying attention to what they're doing. This is particularly problematic in an online study as opposed to a lab study. So we had 60 people learning each language. The training here is they would get 32 stems with each of the two suffixes, so petit, petit-fi, also petit, petit-be. And they were paired with pictures. The suffixes in this case meant either plural or diminutive, counterbalance. So that means that for half the people, be meant diminutive, and for half of them, it meant plural. Then at tests, they were tested on single suffix trials. So they would get more trials with new words, but the same type. So they just had to put one suffix on. So that's what they were trained on. But crucially, they also got these critical double suffix trials. So in this case, for every stem, they had to put both suffixes on there at the same time, and that's not something they had ever seen in training. So here we're really asking them to generalize whatever pattern they learned to this new kind of stimulus they haven't seen before, which is this stem plus two suffixes together to give us this sort of longer word. Okay, yeah, so they see, for the first time, they see diminutive and plural together, so multiple little butterflies. All right. So for our single suffix test trials, this would be a case like gise, and they would choose, this was forced choice, choose between gise-fi and gise-fu. The correct answer would be gise-fi. And for disharmony, they would have disharmonic stems, so giso. So they would choose between giso-fi and giso-fu. The correct answer is giso-fi. Okay, so here's what we found for those kinds of test trials. So we have the two languages again on the x-axis, and we have proportion correct on the y-axis. And what you see here is that, like the Pika et al. Study, we found no difference on these single suffix test trials. So people were above chance, so they did learn something overall, but they learned equally well whether it was harmony or disharmony. So this was basically a complete replication of what Pika et al. Found in their study. But more interestingly, we can look at these double suffix test trials, the ones we really care about. So for Gisei here, they had four options. So Gisei Fibe, Gisei Fube, Gisei Fibo, or Gisei Fubo. So for the harmony case, the answer consistent with the harmony pattern is where everything is harmonic, so this option. Now for disharmony, this is the interesting one. So for Giso, the answer consistent with the disharmony pattern is Giso Fibo, where you have this alternating front back pattern. Okay, so here's what we found for all the participants together. Here the y-axis is again showing proportion correct. Well, it's showing the proportion of the time that people chose the option consistent with the sort of general pattern, the ones sort of circled up there. Here there's four options, so the chance level is 25% instead of 50%. So you can see here, now we get this sort of interesting difference between harmony and disharmony. So you can see for the harmony language, people do sort of consistently choose, or more likely to choose this sort of harmonic pattern. For the disharmony language, we see that people don't really go for this alternating pattern. In fact, they're worse than chance at this, so they actually prefer some other pattern. And so that's a difference. Since we had so many subjects, we did something here as well. We went back to these single suffix trials and we said, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you go across the sort of dotted line, chance line here, 50% chance line, there's a whole lot of participants there that are at chance level. So those people didn't really learn anything. Even though there was an overall effect of learning here, there's a lot of participants that didn't really learn anything. So we said, we really want to know what this subset of people did that we can show statistically actually learned something. So they were above chance in their performance. We want to know what those people did. So we did a subset of the analysis here, and we looked at what those people did on the double suffix trials. And you can see here we get a sort of remarkable disparity in what people have done. So these are the people that we're really confident learned something. And you can see here that for the harmony people, they almost always went for the fully harmonic pattern. And for disharmony, a couple of people went for it, but otherwise they almost never did. Most of the people almost never went for that actual, general disharmony pattern. They went for something else. Okay, so our conclusion from this study was essentially that what has happened in some of these previous studies is that when you give people a stem and a single suffix, there's a lot of things that they could be learning to get the right answer there. So they could learn, for instance, that a specific allomorph of the suffix goes with a specific kind of stem. There's no sense that they have to learn this sort of general pattern. And what we think the study shows is that people in these experiments don't learn a general disharmony pattern. It seems like if you teach people give people this kind of input, they don't learn this general alternating disharmonic pattern. That's not something that people learn from that. So in light of that, we can't really say on the basis of all these previous experiments that harmony and disharmony are equally learnable, because we show here that people haven't actually learned this kind of general disharmony pattern. Okay, so I think there's sort of a good lesson to learn from this study as well, which is that it's important that we think really carefully about what it is people are actually learning in the experiments that we've run, these artificial language experiments. We might have in our heads that people have learned some kind of pattern, but even though the results may come out a certain way, the pattern that we had in mind may not actually be what they've learned. So I think we have to be sort of skeptical with ourselves about what it is that people are learning when they do these experiments, and be very careful, say, with follow-up studies about understanding what it is that people are actually taking away from these studies. Okay. Okay, so this is something that also Alex and Maura touched on earlier, but these two studies together actually give a very nice comparison of these two paradigms. So I thought I would take a quick break here sort of and compare them. There's these are sort of two major paradigms that people use in these sorts of studies. One, for lack of a better word, I call direct learnability, but I think earlier they said ease of learning, which is just as good of a name. And in these kinds of studies, you sort of train two groups on a minimally different pattern and check whether pattern A is learned better than pattern B. So this is sort of what the Pica et al. Study did. So you just trained two different groups of people on two different patterns and see if one does better than the other one. The other one I tend to call poverty the stimulus, which is Colin Wilson's term, but also can be called extrapolation, that was used earlier. And in that case, you train people with an ambiguous set of data, and you see if they prefer one pattern relative to the other one. That's what we did in the sort of study that I just talked about. So just from my point of view, a couple of practical notes. Some pros of using the sort of ease of use or direct learnability paradigm is that it's easier to design usually. It's much easier to come up with this sort of idea of, well, I want to compare two patterns. I'm just going to teach each of them to different groups of people and see which one is better. So it's easier to design. Sort of a disadvantage of that is that it's really prone to ceiling and floor effects. So the amount of training that you give people is really crucial. The issue is that it's really easy to be in a situation where people learn both patterns well. You give them enough training and they just learn everything. And in that case, you don't really know, is that because both patterns are easy to learn? Or is that because you've just given them so much training that they've had enough time to learn both of them? So they're basically, you have what we call a ceiling effect. So for instance, in the Pica et al. Study, they did well both on the vowel harmony and the disharmony case. Is that because there's really no difference, or is that because they just had so much explicit training that they were able to sort of learn both of them by the end of the experiment? We don't know. So in that case, the sort of amount of training is critical because you really have to find the perfect amount of training, if there is a difference, to sort of get it to where the easier one is learned well and the less easy one is not learned quite as well. And if you give them too little training, then they learn neither of them. If you give them too much training, they learn both of them. So it makes it kind of difficult to find that perfect amount of training. So these kinds of studies may require a lot of piloting to really feel confident that you have the right answer. The sort of extrapolation paradigm or poverty of the stimulus paradigm, here you're less prone to ceiling and floor effects because you're training them on ambiguous data. So in fact, you're very happy to give them a ton of training and have them learn whatever those ambiguous data are, learn that perfectly, because you're not testing them on how well they learned that. You're testing them on how they extrapolate. So in that case, usually you have less piloting that you need. You're happy to just give them a lot of training and see how they extrapolate whatever it is that they learn. The sort of negative to that kind of study is that it can be quite difficult sometimes, or impossible maybe even, to design, depending on your question. So there's sort of pros and cons to each paradigm, but it's something that you want to think about when you're sort of designing a study in this area, which one of these paradigms might be best for your purposes. Okay. All right, I'm going to shift gears quite a bit away from vowel harmony and talk about a different kind of topic that I've looked at with artificial language experiments. So this goes back to my sort of dissertation work quite some time ago. So the sort of stimulus for this experiment was finding this interesting kind of phonological alternation called a saltatory alternation. Here's an example of this kind of alternation from Campidanian Sardinian. So in this language, you have P becomes beta, so that's a voice bilabial fricative, V. So P turns into that between vowels, but B remains unchanged in that context. So you can see examples here showing that change in the language. What's interesting about this change in particular is that this p to beta change requires you to change two features at one time. So to get from p to beta, you have to change continuancy, which is going from stop to a fricative, and you have to change voicing, going from a voiceless stop to a voice sound. But what's interesting is that if you put the B in here and it doesn't change, this B is actually just one feature away from both of the sounds that sort of alternate with each other. So it's a voice like the beta, but it's a stop like the P. Okay, so if you're not a phonologist, you might be thinking, why is this weird? So it's weird because we sort of have this idea in phonology that phonological alternations tend to occur between phonetically similar sounds. So we don't really expect that you're going to travel this long distance when you have an alternation between two sounds. Normally, phonological alternations are between sounds that are sort of neighbors near each other phonetically. So this idea was sort of laid out in a paper in a theory by Donka Stereata called the PMAP. And in this theory, Stereata says that speakers sort of develop this mental representation of the similarity of speech sounds, something called the perceptibility map or PMAP. So this might be a fragment of that. For instance, the sounds B and V are really similar to each other. And F and V, for instance, even though they're also kind of one feature different, they're less similar to each other perceptually. Along with this, the idea is that learners have this sort of minimal modification bias during learning. So they assume going into the learning process that phonological processes are going to involve the smallest possible change. That's a substantive bias that people have. That's the idea. Okay, so under this idea, a change like B to V, or a change like P to B, or even the bottom change here, so a change from B to V, but also P to V, these are all sort of likely changes that you might get. These changes all involve changing one sound to sort of its nearest neighbor, or in the case of the bottom case, you might be thinking, well, you got P going to V, that's not the most minimal change. But since you also have B going to V, basically your restriction there is that you can't have stops, say. So everything goes to sort of the nearest sound there, which is V. What's particularly unlikely is this sort of saltatory case where you have P going all the way to V, but B is perfectly legal in whatever context you're talking about. So in that case, you're thinking, why does P go all the way to V? It could just go to B and be fine. So this kind of alternation is sort of inconsistent with this minimal modification bias idea. All right, so this is sort of the background for this study. So my question here is, do learners actually seem to have this minimal modification bias? Do they disprefer this weird sort of saltatory alternation? I should say these saltatory alternations, they're attested, as I showed you in Sardinian there, but they're not common. They're unusual. They're rare. Okay. So this experiment, what I did was expose people to pairs of words, singulars and plurals, like kamap, kamavi. So from this, they should learn this sort of alternation that P goes to V. Then I made sure that they learned this alternation. So they had this sort of verification phase where they had this forced choice test. So kamap, should it be kamapi or kamavi? The right answer is kamavi. Okay, I tested them until they got 80% correct. If they didn't get 80% correct, they had to go back and repeat exposure until they could get 80% correct. So this is sort of a train to criterion method. This is going to be a extrapolation experiment that we were talking about earlier. So as I was saying earlier, in these sorts of experiments, you're really happy to train people until they're really good at this sort of ambiguous input. So here I've trained them to a criterion to make sure they've really gotten this P to V change before they move on. So once they can reach the criterion, they move on into the generalization phase. And here I'm going to test them on what they think about these intermediate sounds So given that they've learned P changes into V, what do they think happens to B, which they've not seen before? Does it also change into V or does it not? Okay, so here's sort of a summary of the input that people got in this experiment. They learned that P changes into V, as I said, and so we have this potentially saltatory condition, that's their sort of critical condition. They learned that P changes into V. They also had a sort of coronal analog here, so T changes into ETH. That's the same kind of change, but with the coronals. There was also a different set of participants who were in a control condition, and here they learned a different alternation, which was between similar sounds. So B changes into V and D changes into ETH. So there you're only changing one feature at a time. In both conditions, people also had some non-alternating filler sounds that didn't change. For now on, I'm just going to show you the labials, but just for simplicity, but the coronals, like the T to ed, it's always there. Okay, so let's look more carefully at this control condition. So here, I trained people that B changes into V. So there's a couple, so this is ambiguous. There's a couple of ways that people could interpret sounds that are missing here. So later, when they see cases of P and F that they haven't seen before, they could assume that those sounds don't alternate with V, so they just stay themselves, or they could change them. This was forced choice, so they only had the option to not change it or to change it into V. So they could assume either of these things. In both cases, you'll note that these patterns are non-saltatory in nature, so the P and the F aren't phonetically intermediate between the alternation that they learned. The case on the left, then they don't have to assume anything new. The case on the right, they do. They have to assume that, oh, there's also these other alternations I haven't seen before. So we might expect that, in fact, we know for previous experiments that people tend not to assume new things that they haven't seen before for no reason. So we might expect that in this case, in this control case, people don't really assume that these sounds change. They don't really have a reason to. In the potentially saltatory condition, however, people have the same sort of interpretations they could make, but here the situation is a bit different. Here, the system that you have on the left is this saltatory condition, which by hypothesis is dispreferred. Whereas the system on the right is non-saltatory. Okay. So the sort of hypothesis here going in is that because the system on the left is saltatory, and people by hypothesis don't like that kind of system, that people in this case should actually be motivated to change these sort of phonetically intermediate sounds with V. Okay. Okay, so here's what I found. I find that this particular study, instead of showing you plots, it's easier to kind of show you the results in this sort of diagram that I've already been showing you, just to make it easier to see what's going on. So at test, first of all, they were tested on the same alternations that they had learned. And you can see that they're really good at applying those alternations that they learned. That's expected. They were trained to criterion again, so it's expected they're really good at those. Okay, now we can look at the sounds that they weren't trained on, so the generalization aspect of this. So you can see in the control condition, when they were asked about this P here, they usually don't change it, so they only change it 21% of the time. But in the potentially saltatory case, when that sound is now intermediate, like phonetically intermediate in the alternation that they learned, now suddenly they overwhelmingly change it, so they change it 70% of the time. And again, this is pretty remarkable because they never saw any evidence that that should happen. That's a complete assumption on their point. So this sort of big difference here between how often they change the P in the control condition and how often they change the B in the sort of potentially saltatory condition suggests that there is some kind of influence here of not wanting to have this saltatory system. The other sound that's sort of intermediate here, the fricative, the F there in the control condition, they don't change it. Sorry, it's not intermediate there. They don't change it. But when it is intermediate, they again change it much more often. So 45% versus 16%. So what we see here is that they're much more likely to assume that these sounds change when there's this pressure to avoid this sort of what could be a saltatory system. We ran a second experiment here just to see what would happen if we actually tried to train people on the saltatory system instead of making the input ambiguous. So here we trained them on the same alternations, but we actually included explicit evidence that the other stops didn't change. So here you can see again they did quite well at the alternation they were trained on. In the control condition now, they also learn very well that this P doesn't change when we train them, tell them that it doesn't change. But you can see here, even though that they had explicit evidence in this that the B doesn't change in this sort of saltatory condition, they still want to change it. So 1 out of 5 trials, they still change it. They still change it much more often here. Here it's a mistake because they actually saw evidence that it shouldn't change. They're actually still much more likely to change it than in the control condition. Okay, so this is quite interesting. It seems like this sort of anti-saltation bias is quite strong. Even when you try to train someone explicitly on the saltatory pattern, they make these errors that would make the system sort of not saltatory. Okay, these other untrained fricatives look the same as they did before. All right, so this was sort of a different kind of study, a different kind of question. To summarize, here what we found is that participants generalized the sort of ambiguous alternations in a way that rendered them non-saltatory. So they tended to generalize the alternation between dissimilar sounds to include the more similar sounds, but not vice versa. So it was only a sort of one-way kind of, it was an asymmetric generalization. And even when we tried to explicitly teach them the saltatory alternation, they tended to make errors and change those intermediate sounds. Okay, so the question that comes up then, is this a substantive bias? Is that what's happening here? So this isn't a talk about modeling, but I did have a paper where I used a probabilistic model to model this, and I implemented this sort of computational version of the PMAP, and you can see here that a substantively biased model actually does a much better job at accounting for the experimental results in this experiment than some comparison models that didn't have this sort of substantive bias baked into it. So again, I'm not going to go into too much detail here about that, but my conclusion here is that this is likely due to some kind of substantive bias. Okay. Okay, I'm going to talk about one last topic here, and this is another sort of shift to a different kind of topic. Here we're going to talk about neutralization and homophony avoidance. I think this is sort of interesting because it also looks a bit more at, as you'll see, a sort of interaction here between phonological learning and lexical learning. So we're sort of looking at the sort of interaction of these two kinds of learning. And this is from a recent paper I did with a former student of mine, Sora Yin. Okay, so neutralization happens in phonology when you have sort of two contrasted things where the contrast is lost. So an example of this is tapping in American English. So we have two distinct verbs, pat and pad. And when you add ing, you get this sort of neutralization of this contrast. So both of those are pronounced patting with this flap in the middle. And patting is ambiguous. It could be pat or it could be pad. So we've lost this contrast. We can talk about neutralization on two levels. So we can talk about it on a phonological level. The contrast between these two sounds is lost. And we can also talk about it at a lexical level. So the contrast between these two distinct words is lost when you add the suffix and get this change. Okay. It's worth keeping in mind, however, that phonological neutralization does not entail that you have this sort of lexical neutralization or homophony creation. So if we imagine a word like getting, for instance, this also has this flap that's derived from this phonological rule. But in this case, it's not ambiguous at all because there is a word get, and there happens not to be an existing word ged in English. So in this case, we have this phonological neutralization, but for this particular example, there's no homophony, just because one of the two sides doesn't exist. So we have potential homophony here, but not actual homophony. Okay, so that's worth keeping in mind. So one thing I should say here is that there's been a lot of work looking at sort of, well, sorry, I should move on to my question. Our question here was, do people find phonological rules more difficult to learn if they're neutralizing? There's been quite a lot of work looking at this in the context of language change. So looking at whether there's neutralization avoidance effects or homophony avoidance effects in language change. But there's much less sort of work looking at it, at least in terms of phonological learning. There's fewer studies looking at it from that perspective. Okay. So the basic scheme in this experiment was we're going to teach people a set of novel phonological rules. We're going to vary whether these rules result in neutralization or not. And then we're going to test to find out if people find the non-neutralizing rules easier to learn than the neutralizing ones. Then we're going to have a second experiment where we also vary whether or not the neutralizing rules result in homophony. Okay, so the method here, we had 30 English speakers. And three phases. We had the exposure phase and then 2 test phases, one with trained items and one with novel items. And everyone in this experiment is learning 4 novel phonological alternations. So t becomes ch, d becomes j, s becomes sh, and z becomes j, all before e. So this is a sort of palatalization rule. Okay, we had 2 languages in this study. And in both languages, people learn the exact same set of alternations. So the same set of rules in both languages. I think the design of the study is maybe my favorite design in any study that I've run. Sorry, Alex, I love our experiment as well. But I think this is my favorite. I think this is a very beautiful design, an example of counterbalancing. So what we've done here is the rules themselves don't vary between the 2 languages, but what does vary is sort of the other phonemes that exist in the phoneme inventories of these languages. So in language A, that language also had the phonemes ch and j as part of their inventories. So you can see here that would render these 2 rules neutralizing because you're changing, say, for instance, the t into a ch. There's already a ch in the language. So that particular pair of rules is neutralizing. This other pair of rules in this language is non-neutralizing. So there's no sh in the language, so s to sh is non-neutralizing. In language B, instead, we had this pair of sounds as phonemes, sh and j. So that renders these 2 rules neutralizing, and the other 2 rules non-neutralizing. So what's really beautiful about this is that we can teach all of our participants the same set of rules, but we've sort of sneakily varied which of the rules are neutralizing and which of the rules are non-neutralizing. So this is important because we don't really care how well someone can learn to becomes ch in this study. What we care about is whether the fact that they're neutralizing or non-neutralizing makes a difference in how easy they are to learn. So we're not going to compare the learnability of language A and language B. What we're going to do is we're going to compare the learnability of the red rules and the learnability of the blue rules here. Okay. Everyone also had this set of filler non-alternating phonemes in the language as well. Okay, so here's what we did. We had we exposed them to some singular nounwords and plural forms ending in E. So all of them had some alternating ta, cha, and da, ja cases. So to suit, to suchi, for instance. These cases were neutralizing in language A, but not language B. They had some cases like duvis, duvishi. These were neutralizing in language B, but not language A. They also had 8 sort of critical non-alternating trials with these sort of critical phonemes that we added. So in language A, that would be buvach, buvachi. In language B, that would be buvash, buvashi. And they also had some non-alternating filler trials, so like vatuk, vatuki, to round it out. We never gave them any illegal sequences, so TD, those sequences are not possible in language A, so they never saw those. Otherwise, we sort of distributed the consonants and vowels equally across the positions. The procedure was pretty straightforward. It's similar to what you've seen already. So to suit, to suchi, they see these 2 pictures. Then they have 2 alternative forced choice tests. So if dazat is a cal, then multiple cals, dazachi or dazati. That's the test. In the test, we had 2 phases. So first we tested them on some trained items. So some of the same stems they had seen in training already. Then we trained them on some novel items, so some new stems they hadn't seen before. And the main focus here is on the novel items. The novel items are going to be the ones that tell us whether they've learned some kind of general rule. The trained items in these kinds of studies can always be sort of memorized or recognized. They might just recognize that they've seen that in training before. So they can do quite well in those even if they haven't learned any kind of general pattern. So it's a good idea to include sort of novel items. Okay, so here are the results. Here we have trained items on the left, novel items on the right. On the x-axis, you can see the groups, so the neutralizing rules versus the non-neutralizing rules. And on the y-axis, we can see the mean accuracy. Okay, so we find a difference between the trained and novel items. This is again expected. We almost always see that people do better on trained items than novel items because again, they've seen them before. But more importantly, we see a difference here, a significant difference between the neutralizing and non-neutralizing rules in both the trained and the novel items. So it turns out that people actually do a lot better on the non-neutralizing rules than the neutralizing rules. And again, you can remember this is the same set of rules, so there's nothing about the rules themselves that could be causing this effect. It's the same set of rules. The only thing that's different is whether the rules are neutralizing or non-neutralizing. We also compared them to, there's no interaction. We also compared them to chance level performance. And you can see here that it seems like they have learned something in all the cases, except in the novel items when the rules were neutralizing, actually people didn't do statistically better than chance. So it actually seems like they didn't learn very well at all, the neutralizing rules here. Okay, so we ran a second experiment here, and the question in this experiment was, well, how much of this neutralization avoidance effect is actually driven by homophony avoidance? So one thing I didn't tell you originally is that in experiment 1, we made it such that the neutralizing rules resulted in homophony 50% of the time when they applied. In experiment 2, we actually manipulate the amount of homophony here. So if homophony actually matters, then the more homophony that's created, then the more difficult the neutralizing rules should be to learn. If it doesn't matter, then there shouldn't be a difference. So the way we did this is that in experiment 1, which I sneakily didn't tell you originally, half of the cases here resulted in homophony. So to suit became to suchi, for instance. There was also a word in there, to such, which also was to suchi in the plural. So you can see there that to suit and to suchi, which are 2 different stems, they're homophonous in their plural form. So half of the cases worked that way. The other half of the cases didn't work that way, so they weren't similar to each other. So what we did in experiment 2 was we separated that into 2 conditions. We had a homophony condition where in an extreme case, we divided it in an extreme way, so all of the words, all of the cases created homophony whenever the neutralizing rules applied, and we had no homophony condition, where in this case, none of them created homophony. So the rules were still phonologically neutralizing, but they never created any homophony. Okay, so here's what we found here. Here I'm just showing you the novel items, which are the ones the important ones. So on the left side, we have the homophony condition, and on the right side, we have the no homophony condition. Okay, so what you see here is very interesting. So we have this interaction effect. And the way that works out is that in the no homophony condition, we don't see any difference between the neutralizing and the non-neutralizing rules. They're learned equally well. Whereas in the homophony condition, we see this big difference. The non-neutralizing rules, again, are learned quite well. The neutralizing rules are not learned well at all. They're at chance level, actually. So it seems like when the rules are neutralizing and also create a lot of homophony, people don't do well at learning those rules at all. Suddenly they can't learn them. They're at chance level. Okay. We didn't design the study to look systematically at the amount of homophony in terms of a sort of linear way. But if you put all of the results together, we had sort of 3 different amounts of homophony here, ranging from 100% to 50% to 0%. And if you look there, you can see this sort of steady increase here, where when there's no homophony, people do okay at the neutralizing rules. They learn them, pretty fine. But when there is some amount of homophony, people do worse. And it seems like the more homophony there is, the worse they do. It is also the case that statistically, at least, whenever there was any homophony, people didn't really learn it. They were statistically at chance level. All right. So I'm wrapping up here. So to just summarize this experiment, we see that when there's 50% homophony in experiment 1, the non-neutralizing rules were learned better than the neutralizing rules, and the neutralizing rules were at chance. When there's 100% homophony in experiment 2, the non-neutralizing rules were learned better than the neutralizing rules, and the neutralizing rules were at chance. When there's no homophony, in that case, the non-neutralizing rules were equal to the neutralizing rules, and everything was above chance level. So all of this together suggests that the effect that we saw here was actually triggered by homophony avoidance, not really phonological neutralization per se. It seems like really what's mattering here is the homophony. So this suggests that rules that cause homophony are harder to learn. And this is really interesting because it actually suggests that there's this sort of interaction going on between phonological learning and lexical learning. So just by giving these participants these cases where these singulars were becoming homophonous in the plural, this inhibited their ability to learn this phonological rule. That kind of interaction between lexical learning and phonological learning is not really predicted by a lot of models of phonology that are sort of feed forward, say. So the fact that we have this sort of interaction going on during learning is very interesting. Okay, so I think that's where I will end today. So I've hopefully given you there like a sort of tour of some different kinds of questions that at least I've looked at using these kinds of methodologies in phonology. And hopefully also you've sort of taken away some of the different kinds of paradigms that can be used in phonology and some methodological and design issues that are kind of relevant here. Okay, so I'll end there and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thanks very much, Jamie. That was great. Super clear. So just I'll let you handle your own questions, Jamie, but I just wanted to remind everyone that you're all students. So, I mean, none of you knows a ton about artificial language learning, so you should all feel free to ask, whatever questions at whatever level that you have. So, if you have a clarification question, probably someone else has that question too. And there's not very many of us. So the hope is that, we can really get some conversation going. So I really do encourage all of you to ask questions.
Yep, ditto. Yes, question from Jorge.
Hello. Can you see me?
Yes.
Right. So this is perhaps a general question about artificial language research, and maybe it will come up more explicitly at some point in the workshop. But at least I can get your view on this.
Mhm.
Is there ever a concern that most of these are between subjects to signs, and if so, what's the feasibility of doing this, or what's the pros and cons of doing this within subjects at any point?
Mhm. Yeah, it's an excellent question. Yeah, so just in case people maybe that aren't as familiar with experimental design, between subjects here means that you have different people doing the different conditions, different groups of people, and within subjects would mean that you have the same people doing all the conditions. It's an excellent question. I would say that in general, if you're doing the sort of ease of learning paradigm, I personally think you need to do a between subjects design. Um, I think the problem with doing a within subjects design for that kind of paradigm is that basically, in that case, you would have people learning one language and then learning another language after that, usually something like that. And I just feel like it's sort of impossible to not taint them in the first time that they learn a language. Of course, you can sort of control for that by like changing the order that people do the two in. It's just I personally wouldn't usually do that. There's a negative of that, of course, which is that between subjects designs give you far less sort of statistical power. So you have to have a lot more subjects. You have to worry about making sure everything is really perfectly controlled and things like that. Um, so that's a sort of negative of doing that. But I usually personally would go towards between subjects design for that. Another advantage of this sort of extrapolation paradigm is that that one usually is within subjects. Because if you're sort of giving people ambiguous
Right.
input and seeing which of the two patterns they actually prefer or kind of extrapolate to, by its nature, that's sort of within subject design. And that to me is another sort of benefit of doing that kind of paradigm. I would normally suggest personally that if your research question lends itself to the extrapolation or poverty of the stimulus paradigm, that you go at that one, because you can do it within subjects. You have more statistical power for that reason. You need less participants. You also, for like I mentioned earlier, you don't have to pilot as much usually because you don't have to worry as much about exactly how much input to give people, how much training to give people. So I normally recommend to people that if your question lends itself, do that extrapolation paradigm. Some questions don't lend themselves to doing that paradigm, and you need to do the other paradigm. But that's sort of that's my personal view. It may be that Jenny or other people have different opinions on that, but yeah.
Thank you
Does
very
that
much.
answer the question?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Good. Question from Stefan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I was wondering, well, thank you. I thought that was a really, really interesting talk. So thanks
Mm,
first. I was
Thank you.
wondering if you could talk a little bit about how your stimuli and the response choices were presented to participants. Was there an acoustic signal? Was it orthography? And if it was an orthographic representation, how did you work to ensure that they like arrived at the pronunciation you wanted it to sound like?
Yeah. So I have never used orthography in an artificial language learning experiment for phonology. I mean, I do phonology, so I've never used orthography in any experiment. So it's always an auditory stimulus without any orthography presented. Um, I Maybe there are reasons why you might want to use orthography in one of these experiments, but I can't really think of too many. I think normally you want to have an auditory stimulus in these experiments, yeah, because there's so many issues with orthography, some of which you mentioned. So you don't really know how people are interpreting it always. You're normally in these studies, you actually want to pull people away from thinking about their orthography, which is impossible to do entirely, of course, but giving them the orthography there on the screen is sort of encouraging them to think about the letters and not, the sounds involved. So I think normally you would go with an auditory stimulus if possible.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to allow for awkward pauses in questions because really, yeah. I mean, I'm sure Alex and Maura and I could jump in here, but I'm not going to do that. So I hope you all have some more questions to ask.
I'm comfortable with awkward pauses. It's fine. I'm a bad question asker, so it takes me a long time also to, when I'm in an audience, to like think up a good question or any question often. So I totally understand. Yeah, that's a good point as well. So I'm happy to hear. I should say, I mean, this will also come up in the tutorial later, but when I share advice and tips with you, that's completely just off of my opinion, mostly from like years of doing these experiments, and it's not always based on like clear, data that there's one best way to do things. Is kind of just my opinion. And I bet that I would say things that Alex, Jenny, and Laura disagree with.
Unsurprisingly, so far so good. I think I agree with everything that you've said so far. So even the comments on the beauty of your design for your previous experiment.
This is a conspiracy of phonologists.
Well, to be fair, yeah, I mean, this is.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, I think if you're not doing phonology, using orthography is much more common in artificial language learning experiments, in case that wasn't clear. I mean, we often have both at the same time, because why not? But we're often really not interested at all in how people are learning the lexical items. We want to know what they do with those lexical items. So whatever can make it easier for them to learn the lexical items we do, and orthography sometimes makes it easier for people to learn.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, yeah, in phonology, we're almost always trying our hardest to get people to not think about the orthography of whatever language it is they happen to speak. Whereas in syntax or semantics, I think you're less worried about that.
This is something that's come up in strategy reports and experiments that I've done, where you can find that people will occasionally articulate really specific strategies that they use that are based on orthography that you sometimes have to go back and like check. So I've had in vowel harmony experiments, people talk about letters at the beginning of the alphabet and letters at the end of the alphabet. So even though we weren't presenting any orthography, they still tried to have this representation and articulate it in a strategy. Sorry, I'll shut up now because we have another question.
It's actually me again. No, I was gonna say about what Jenny just said, that right, like having both at the same time. It on the one hand, I can see the advantages of saying like, why not? This might help. On the other hand, it depends on the kind of questions you have. Like my typical questions and my reason to use artificial languages is to look at to have a really controlled environment for testing for influence of previously acquired languages, right? And typically there's more than one. And so I always worry that if I present orthography and phonology together, I am forcing an orthography to phonology mapping on them, and that might kind of like constrain the way that this influence happens in some way. So in cases where, just the most cases where you might want to keep that neutral, then that sort of comes up as a challenge, right? I think.
One comment on that I think is interesting. Like, so it's really difficult. So if you don't present orthography, you aren't necessarily biasing them in a certain way, but it's really difficult to understand the mappings that participants have made themselves. And some people are able to articulate them well, but most people, especially in phonology, are not. One comment on this orthographic mapping thing is that I've personally run experiments using auditory stimuli that were produced by a speaker of a language that the participants didn't know. So they're having a sort of more naive experience listening to the stimuli, and they don't have fixed orthographic mappings from a language they do know to those specific sounds that they're hearing. And that's sort of my interpretation for why in the study that I mentioned before, where we saw a difference between harmony and disharmony, that was a case where we used non-native stimuli with the participants, and we saw this difference emerge where with the experiment with Jamie, we ran the experiment using using stimuli produced by a speaker of the language that the participants knew, and in that case we replicated the pica non-effect in the single suffix thing. So you can really get some sort of fine-grained differences based on whether or not potentially the participants have orthographic mappings for the stimuli that you're presenting them.
Right. That's very interesting. Thanks.
A question by Remy.
Okay, so hi, thank you for the talk. I have a question about vowel harmony and disharmony. So basically what you said, correct me if I'm wrong, you said that typologically vowel harmony is common. And disharmony is very rare, and there is no clear motivation about why it happened. And then you test your hypothesis on English speakers. Will it be interesting to look at the populations, even if they are rare, to test them on artificial language to see how they respond, and then to compare, see if in your experiment they behave the same way as English speakers? Then it could mean that it's an accident, that they have vowel disharmony, but they still have like the cognitive mechanism that makes them against it.
Yeah, so an issue is that I said that it's very rare, but I actually don't know of a case. So I'm hesitant to ever say something's unattested these days, because anytime I say that, someone's like, "There's this case where blah 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 blah." But I don't know, Alex, do you know of a case of vowel disharmony?
And it could be like to any general phonological pattern that is rare versus common.
Yeah.
What studying those populations in specific could tell us about what you're studying? Because I mean, it's good to do studies on English, but
I see. Yeah. So a good person actually I think that is a good question, and a good person to talk about that would be Alex and Jenny, who have done this work looking at, for instance, prefix versus suffixing, and prefix preferring languages being more rare, but they actually did the work to test this with speakers of one of these languages with prefixing preference.
Yeah, so to respond to the first question, I actually also, so I know Martin Kramer has a paper on Ainu where he has an analysis that looks like superficially productive disharmony.
Sorry, Can I just jump in and say that, Remy, I think you're sharing your screen.
Oh, sorry,
Yes, you are.
my bad. How do I stop?
I mean, it's nice to see your notes, but.
Oh, okay, sorry. Arrêtez le partage. Okay, sorry.
So there are some claims for some languages that there's an analysis that you can get productive disharmony for, but I think that it's in a very small corner and it's only with like maybe one pair of vowels or something like this, so it's not really overwhelmingly convincing. On the more to your points, I think this is exactly the type of work that, for example, Jenny's project on U20 has aimed to do. So this is looking at a word order preferencing, where we are exploring the effect in populations of different L1 speakers whose languages have different configurations. So it would be something akin to comparing a language that has vowel harmony to a language that has no vowel harmony to a language that has vowel disharmony, and seeing what type of outcomes we have specifically for the reasons that you're proposing. If in an experiment we can sort of get away from L1 biases, orthographic biases, these types of things, then we should expect that if there is an underlying mechanism driving the typological effect, we should be able to observe it in these different populations, potentially modulated to a different degree, depending on how far away we can get from L1 influence. But yeah, so that is indeed work that we have tried to do in other domains, at the very least.
And we do have some published work that Jamie was mentioning about the suffixing preference. So the population that we're working with has an unusual noun phrase word order, but it's also heavily prefixing. It's a Bantu language. So we do have some experimental work showing that the prefixing, the apparent preference for suffixing, is found in English speakers, but it's not found in Kidaraka speakers. So that raises the question of whether this is really something that all speakers have, or it's something that people have learned. Now, of course, I think it's maybe sometimes a lot to ask that we see all preferences in all speakers. If people have a substantial experience with one kind of pattern, it's maybe not surprising. Nevertheless, it's always the strongest result. So we always want to see it there.
Yeah, I think in general, this question of like testing different experiments and different patterns with speakers of different first languages that have different properties is extremely understudied in this field and very interesting, and just now starting to be studied a little bit. Also very difficult, but so I mean, about vowel harmony, a project that Alex and I are both part of as well, where we've been testing this sort of vowel harmony locality preference with speakers from a bunch of different languages. A sort of interesting thing that has come out of that is that we tested this experiment with Turkish speakers that has vowel harmony, and they have no more of a preference for local vowel harmony than any of the other speakers, even though there's vowel harmony in their language. So that's really interesting. And I think generally it's interesting to see in these cases, in what cases do people sort of pull their knowledge out from their native language and put it on these experiments, and in what cases do they not do that? And I think that's really interesting to see both ways.
A side note on that is also that those stimuli indeed were produced by a speaker of a language that none of the participants knew. So again, we're in that case of naive phonetic listening, which you might have noticed I have a thing about. So I think that can explain it all.
Yeah. Great. Question from. Thank you. Another question from Lean?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for the talk. Really interesting and informative. My question is actually also a more general one. I want to ask what really constitutes a domain-specific bias, because like the vowel harmony situation you mentioned in your talk, well, I can also consider such preference as something that arises from for some independent reasons that are not specific to language, like people generally would prefer something more consistent instead of something that is not consistent. Yes, so my question would be what really constitutes domain-specific bias?
Yep, it's a good question and a hard question. And I think indeed, that's why it gets so murky, because almost any case where you say, I have evidence for substantive bias, then something comes along and says, well, it could be this other sort of general bias really that's explaining that. And the amount of times that happens, like that seems to always happen. So it's a very difficult question. And I think it's very difficult to sort of nail down, like, this is definitely a substantive domain-specific bias that's causing this effect.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, oh, sorry, were you gonna?
No, go ahead, Jenny.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's also further complicated by the fact that, most things in language that we conceive of as domain general biases are going to interact with language specific stuff to some degree. So, what you mean by simplicity is really quite dramatically dependent on what representations you think people have. So I think this is a difficult question. One that I think artificial language learning approaches probably have something to say about. So, if you have some idea of, how to generalize something beyond the particular domain you tested in, many people have tried doing artificial language learning experiments with shapes or sounds or like tones or other stimuli that aren't linguistic in nature, where you can try to tease apart this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's good to talk to like psychologists about these kinds of things too, because I think as linguists we often have the like language blinders on, where we see everything as like everything is about language, everything is special about language. But often if you talk to a psychologist or kind of general cognitive scientist, they'll say, yeah, that sounds just like this thing that we know in vision, or in general pattern learning, or they can sort of help you strip away our sort of kind of thinking that everything is special in language. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you again, Jamie, for that, and thanks all for your questions. And we now have a lunch break until 1:30 UK time, and then we'll come back and hear more from Jamie, more practical stuff from Jamie in his tutorial. So have a nice break, and we'll see you back in an hour and a half. Okay, thanks again.
See you in a bit. Bye.